We're going to be talking about God's plans. You know what? Before we even start that, I don't want to give anybody the impression via the internet that it's cold in Mexico. There are some people that this week are going to be traveling to Chicago, and I will tell you, you will probably need a scarf, a couple of coats there. But here in Mexico, we don't really need that. Matter of fact, there was a couple of people showing up today, and I said, my goodness, they're showing up in shorts, a couple, just 10 days before Christmas. You are committed to the Mexican weather and culture when at Christmas time you're still wearing shorts. But here we are, because God has great plans for us. You know, we could have our own plans. And I'll tell you, honestly, I can come up with really good plans. But my plans are still just good plans in comparison to the great plans, the perfect plans that are God's. And we're going to be talking about God's wonderful plans today and how He speaks to us and changes the plans that we may have. How many of you have ever had a good plan and then God ruined it? I've had that happen. You know what? I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to try today to be honest. You know, it's not always easy to be honest, but I'm going to try to be honest with you, and I'm going to tell you that I tend to get frustrated when my plans don't go through. I tend to feel like I've invested so much energy, thought, and the process of creating a plan, and then when it doesn't quite go the way that I want it to go, then I can get a little bit frustrated, even if it was just my plan for tomorrow. I have my things to do list, and if I don't get through it, it doesn't work out the way that I want it to work out, I can get a little bit frustrated. And as I was thinking about that, and I'm sure I'm the only one around here like that we make plans, and then later on, if they don't quite work out, we get frustrated. But no, I think that, as a matter of fact, the majority of people are like that, because we make plans and structure our life. This is who I'm going to be. This is what I'm going to do in a large sense, but even on the smaller sense of what we're going to do. I'll give you an example. Imagine. Now, this is just fictional. This is just imaginary. This is hypothetical, if you will. Imagine that the church offered a raffle, and you were going to have the potential of winning an all-inclusive vacation. Now, just imagine this. And the date came for the raffle to be drawn. And lo and behold, the drawn number, although Maida is praying about it, it was your number. Imagine that. And then 2 days before you're ready to leave, you find out that the trip was canceled. How many would say that would be kind of frustrating? It's only hypothetical. This isn't really going to happen. But have you ever had a situation where you're looking forward to something, and something is going to happen, and then at the last moment, everything changes? I can give you an example of that. There was a time when I had gathered my family. My boys were little. This was while we were still living in California, and we had gathered our family together. We took a trip, a long trip that took nearly 10 hours in the car to get there. We stayed in a hotel because the next morning we were going to go to Disneyland. Well, before we got up in the morning and before Disneyland could open, all of a sudden, that's when 9/11 was. The towers collapsed and they closed Disneyland. How many know that when your plans don't quite go through, you can be frustrated? Imagine little kids trying to figure out why they don't get to go to Disneyland the next day after they've been planning it for so long, had taken the trip, and now there they were. What are we going to do because Disneyland is closed? You can understand frustration when you have a plan and then it doesn't go through. And I started to think a little bit about the Christmas story. You know, sometimes we look at the Christmas story and we just think of it as this nice story and how Jesus was born and how wonderful it was. We imagine Jesus being born there in that manger, in that feeding trough. We don't imagine the smelly animals and the stench that would be associated with being in a stable, if you will. We don't imagine, we kind of candy coat because this is a story. story, but I started to think about the plans that must have been there, part of the life of Joseph and Mary. I mean, as the story clearly goes through, it says that they had plans. You can't get engaged without making a plan. You know what the word engagement means? That you're planning on getting married. Just knowing this is the structure, I have to wonder, was Joseph, when he was growing up, he gathered around with his friends, he probably said, you know what, when I grow up, my plan is to marry a pregnant woman. Hello? And then run for our lives a bunch of times. That's what my plan for life is. No, that couldn't have been his plan. But Joseph, nonetheless, shows us in the text that we're going to be at this morning, he shows us that he's willing to alter his plans. Rather than getting frustrated, he's allowing himself to be in the presence of God and ask God for his direction and his guidance. Because as I already stated, you could have a good plan, but God has great plans. You could even have a great plan, but God has perfect plans. And this is the God that we are serving. And look at what it says in our text this morning in Matthew 1:18-25. I know that it's our normal structure for the sermons that come out of our Bible reading. And we didn't read this last week. But here we are before Christmas, and we're going to take advantage of the story, and we're going to look at what God is saying to us through the Christmas story in this season. This is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. In other words, they were engaged. But before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace. He had in mind to divorce her quietly. Here the translation says, faithful to the law. If you will, we could go through and say he was a righteous man. He was somebody that looked at what was supposed to be done according to what God says, and then he did it. Now, you know what? I'll tell you, you don't just naturally become a righteous person. You don't just by gravitation get pulled into doing the right thing. Matter of fact, it's the opposite. If you want to just go with the flow, you're not going to end up a righteous person. And just the thing saying that Joseph was faithful to the law, we're saying that he had made specific decisions about his life. Not only in this moment, he was faithful to the law. And so we have to understand that Joseph clearly had plans set in place for his life, and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace. He had in mind to divorce her quietly. We'll get back to that in just a moment. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife. Because why? What is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. And so we clearly see here are some plans. If you were to go in and say, Joseph, let me ask you a couple of questions. Do your plans include marrying a pregnant woman, and the day you get married, you don't get to go on a honeymoon, and you don't get to touch her for a year or so? I will tell you, he'll probably say, no, those aren't my plans. But this is how the story unfolds before us. And I look at this and I say, nothing of what is happening here would be according to what Joseph wanted in life. As he started to figure out and plan his life, you have to imagine, because nobody that I know of, I can't imagine anybody, even the greatest of prophets, thinking that this was going to be the plan of their life. If we get frustrated with just one thing going out of order tomorrow, could you imagine if your life plan all of a sudden fell apart? I can imagine. There was one point when I thought everything was falling apart, and I decided that my new life theme verse was Job 17:11. My days have ended, my plans are shattered, and so are the desires of my heart. But isn't that a great life theme verse? And as I thought about everything that I wanted, what was I saying? I was feeling sorry for myself because my plans didn't work out without having an eye to see what potentially God was doing in the midst of the plans. We have to be willing like Joseph here. And I have to I take my hat off to him, because the issue is that Joseph here, when he finds out that Mary is pregnant, we have no record of his, how should we say it? Losing his cool. We don't find him exploding. It says that he's a righteous man, and he goes away to consider, to contemplate, to figure out what was his next play, if you will. Well, I'll tell you, and I'll be honest with you. If it were me, I would have had plenty to say at the moment, and then later on thought about it. How many have a tendency when your plans don't quite function the way you want them to be, people don't act the way you want them to act, you tell them so, and then you repent later on about it? We all have that sometimes in our hearts, don't we? But we don't have this happening in Joseph. Joseph here is seeing this all happen. He has some very specific plans, because you can't be engaged to somebody without specific plans. All of a sudden he's told, oh, by the way, Mary is pregnant. Your whole life is turned upside down. Every plan you have is now of naught. And what does he do? He withdraws. He doesn't go and tell her just exactly what he thinks of her. He doesn't explode about the whole issue. He doesn't have the disappointment shine forth in his life. What were some of the plans that they may have had? Well, if they were an engaged couple, I can tell you some of the things that engaged couples talk about. Well, they may talk about where they're going to live after the wedding. I remember before Lori and I got married, we had conversations. She knew that we were going to go away on a honeymoon. The day we got back from the honeymoon, we were going to be packing up, and we were going to be moving 8 or 9 hours away from where her mommy is. We knew this. And she had to understand this was the plan. This is where we were going. She had to understand. And we talk about children. Many couples decide how many children they're going to have. They're going to decide what they're going to be doing in life afterwards. They're going to be planning the structure of their home and who's responsible for what. You know, the couple comes together and says, okay, I work and I do this, and you are in charge of. Be nice, she says. For the next 50 years, don't expect me to wash dishes. They decide what their life plan, the structure of their home was going to be. And the reason why they decide these things is because their plans are based on a couple of key elements. They're based on love. When we talk about love out of 1 Corinthians 13 talks about the confidence, the trust level. You could imagine as these plans were created and Joseph thought that he knew Mary, and all of a sudden Mary's pregnant, how he would have felt like betrayed. And all the plans were of naught. Couples base their plans on their love and their life goals. I remember when we were in premarital counseling, and even before that, in proposing to Lori, I simply told her, you know what, just don't bother to even say yes to me if you're not willing to live outside of this country. Our pastor who did premarital counseling said to her, look, Lori, you're going to be moving somewhere else. Are you ready? Are you willing? And as a matter of fact, he said to her, are you called to be a missionary? And Lori looked at him in all of the wisdom of a teenager and said, I don't know anything about that. I'm just called to be at his side. And the pastor accepted it. But we base our plans on aspects, on details of who we are. It's very important for everybody involved that the plan succeeds. No one goes into marriage saying, oh, we made great plans, and now I just hope they all fail. All of these plans would have been in place by Joseph and Mary. And then God shows up. How many of you ever had God show up? That phrase, then God shows up. You say, God, why didn't you show up when we were first creating these plans? God, why didn't you tell us certain things, certain details before we made the plans? That way we could have included all of the things that you wanted in our plans. And people could have been asking Joseph, Joseph, what are you going to do when you get married? Oh, we're going to run away to Bethlehem and then live for a while in Egypt. He could have felt really good about it being his plan. Hello? But God doesn't do it that way. Sometimes the plans that we have, we think, oh, we have it all set up. When we came as a family to Mexico 16 years ago, and we crossed the border, we had a great plan. We were going to live in Mexico for 6 to 8 months. That's how long. Because we were going to learn Spanish, and then we were going to go to another country in Latin America, Colombia. And then when we came to this church 13 and a half years ago, we were sent out here. And the plan was, go out there and just cover the pulpit, and you need to be out there for 3 months. That was 13 and a half years ago. You know, I want to tell you that we can make good plans. But if we're not willing to allow those plans to be subject to approval and changed by God, then something is dramatically wrong. So how do you respond when your plans don't work out? I already confessed that I can get irritated. I can get a little frustrated. I can have a short fuse in those moments when they really aren't all that important. Just a detail about tomorrow. And what more could we say when it's our life plan? This is who we're going to be for the rest of our lives. It's impossible. How could these things not result in disappointment and not having what we've so diligently planned for? And you've got to imagine that Joseph at this moment is suffering great disappointment. He withdraws, and it says that he's considering a couple of things. What's he considering? He's considering just quietly divorcing her. He's just considering just eliminating the situation, but he's righteous. He hasn't blown up. He's considering his options. He's trying to make new plans because the plans that he had already made with her weren't going to work out. And he's trying to figure it all out based on his character. He's a righteous person. He's one that follows the law, and he's not one that's going to subject them to public disgrace. He's not going to be one that's going to expose her to all of the things that he thinks she deserves. The response to many people's disillusionment and frustration of their plans is not a positive one. I'll give you an example. Go back to the vacation idea. Let's move it away from that idea of a church raffle because that was too close to home. Just as imagine that you tell your family, we're going to go away on vacation. We're going to go away on vacation. And the whole family starts to prepare for the vacation. And then 2 days before the vacation, the boss calls and says, you can't take those days off. Everything was planned. You go home and you tell your family, look, we're not going to be able to go away on vacation. You know what in a lot of families happens? The children go on to their social media, and they text to their friends and family, Dad's blowing it again. Hello? Sometimes the wife calls her friend down the street and says, yeah, we made these great plans, but, you never can count on my husband. These are the kinds of things that happen at times. But none of this was something that crossed the mind of Joseph because he starts off, and here's one of the key elements that we need to understand about learning to accept God's plan, is the first step is that we have to be righteous people. You will always have a problem accepting the perfect plan of God instead of your own personal plan if you think that you're the sovereign leader. We can get frustrated that my life is no longer in my control if we are the ones responsible. But righteous people are the ones that have submitted themselves to God and say, God, this is what you want. I want to obey you. And so Joseph doesn't have this rash decision. He's not accusing Mary of different things. He's not saying, this is what I want out of you now. You got to prove to me what such and such a thing. No, none of these things happen. He withdraws and he begins to contemplate. He says, based on my character, on who I am, I can't expose her to public disgrace. I can't tell everyone that it's her fault. Now, how many like to blame people when something doesn't work out well? And I'll tell you, the majority of people don't like to blame themselves, but love to blame other people. That's what the majority of people do. Matter of fact, last week, remember, we got the screen working, by the way, today. Last week, the screen wasn't working. Last week, the screen wasn't working. And I told you the reason why that screen wasn't working, didn't I? I told you openly and blatantly that I destroyed the cable. 30-meter long cable. Well, that was already out there in the open. Wednesday came along. And we'd already replaced the cable. It's a new cable. It's not repaired. It's a new cable. It's there, and here we go. And we were in the middle of a staff meeting. And Maida comes into the staff meeting, and Maida says to me, I don't think she's around, but she can confirm this later on. She comes in, and she says, I feel like I should treat you like you might treat us. And I want to do some bullying about that cable that you broke. Yeah, I know you don't believe that I would ever bully a person, tease them, be sarcastic with them, that kind of thing. No, that wouldn't be a part of pastor's life, right? And I looked at Maida, I said, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm waiting for it. And Maida gets quiet. I said, no, go ahead. Tell me all that you want to tell me about the terrible thing that I did, and I broke this cable, and go ahead. And she says, no, I'm going to be nice. I said, Maida, you're not trying to be nice. You just don't have a leg to stand on when it was already exposed in public. What more could you say? You understand what I'm saying? And sometimes we like to hide things, and then later on somebody finds out, oh, that was the way it really was. Hello? When it was about us. But here, Joseph doesn't come along and say, you know what? It's all her fault. If it wasn't for her, my plans would all work out. He decides before the angel shows up, before he hears from God, he's already a righteous person and has already decided he will not subject Mary to public disgrace. His natural response, because of being a righteous person, was one of a positive response. When the response of many whose lives did not turn out the way they wanted, who were impatient and frustrated because their plans weren't what they wanted them to be, because they're not in control. The life of most people end up blaming others. But Joseph's immediate response was, I'm not going to be yelling at Mary, and I'm not going to subject her to public disgrace. No one is going to know about this. I'm going to divorce her quietly. He decides to do this in secret. Why? Because in the day, and many of you understand the structure of the culture in Mexico. If you do not, let me explain it to you. In Mexico, it is not like in the United States when you're talking about a marriage. In the United States, I can't tell you how many times I had to sign a particular marriage certificate. They would go down to the recorder's office, they would get this certificate, and an ordained minister can sign these, and it was that signature that was then the next week brought to the county recorder's office, that was recorded, and they were officially married. That was what happens, and that's what happens in the United States. In Mexico, it's not like that. In Mexico, a pastor is not allowed to perform a marriage ceremony. What happens in Mexico is similar, but at the same time dissimilar to what happens in the United States. Just as that couple has to go to the recorder's office and get that marriage certificate in the United States, they have to do that here. But here, the marriage license cannot leave. Here, the recorder has to do the ceremony and goes through at that moment and gets their signature on it. They sign it. They say, I do. Everything is completed. Everything is finished. And then they take and come to the pastor and say, we've fulfilled all of the legal responsibilities. We would like to get married. Before the government, they're already married. But in the church, in the Christian church, they don't consider themselves married yet. They consider that they're waiting because they want to be married before God. And so they come before in the church building or so wherever that ceremony may take place. They go ahead and they do it in this other location with a pastor in their church and so forth. And that's the date that they celebrate as their wedding. I'll give you just a little heads up. Sometimes that's a brief period of time. Sometimes that's a long period of time between one and the other. But they don't consider themselves married until the pastor has pronounced them husband and wife. It's interesting. If you were to go, for example, and ask Matt and Maida, what's the date of their wedding? What's their anniversary? They'll give you two dates. Because one is a legal one that's written on their marriage license, and the other one is the one that God recognized. And so you can understand that there was this disjointedness here in this culture if you have the mindset of the United States. Well, we could take you back into the time with Mary and Joseph. They were already committed. They were already promised. It was already a contract. It was already a done deal. And that's why Joseph had to consider divorcing her privately, secretly, apart from, because it was already a legal binding issue, but it had yet to take place before God. And here we have him contemplating all of these things. And if you say that you're already to that level where you are legally bound, could you imagine how much more that would embolster the feeling of being deceived? She already signed. We're already promised. It's already a commitment. But even beyond that level, Joseph, in his righteousness, says, I'm not going to embarrass her. I don't know what all has happened. I'm not going to embarrass her. So Joseph took time to consider, I'm sure, many options. But being a righteous person, we can imagine that he was also seeking God for the answer. And he comes up with these ideas. And you have to understand that based on him being a righteous person, his heart to not hurt people and to be a loving person was a part of these decisions. But even then, they were still his decisions. I'm going to divorce her secretly. I'm not going to embarrass her. And his decisions, although elevated beyond what many of us may contemplate, but his decisions were still not the perfect decision. He was seeking God. He says, God, what do I need to do? And his emotions would have been involved. How many ever have emotional connection to your plans? I'm sure Joseph had an emotional connection to his plans. And while he had all of his emotions invested in this plan that now was never going to happen, and he's creating this new plan. I'm going to divorce her quietly. I'm going to put her off to the side. It's going to be okay. I can rescue this situation. I can figure it all out. I'm still the righteous person that God has always intended for me to be. And while he's considering all of these things, God shows up and says, Joseph, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. Now, at that moment, you would say, if that were you, the decision is going to change everything. Let me give you a couple of things that is going to change. In one night, every plan was destroyed. Where is he going to live? How many children is he going to have? The structure of the home, everything has changed. In one night, his life changed forever. What people thought of him was going to change. Let me give you a quick excerpt from later on in the same Gospel of Matthew. In chapter 13, in verse 53, this is what it says. And I understand that the context here is talking about the faith of the community. But listen to what is being said here. It says, when Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there, coming to his hometown. This would have been the town he grew up in, the town that knew his father, his mother, or his stepfather, we should say, his family, all of this, seeing the structure growing up. They're the ones that knew all about Jesus. He's coming to his hometown. He began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers, they asked. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get these things? And they took offense at him, but Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town and in his own home. And he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. Now look at that phrase in verse 57. It says, and they took offense at him, Jesus. But notice what they say earlier. They say, isn't this, in verse, I guess I went the wrong way. Let me go the other way. Isn't this the carpenter's son? It's as though many scholars say that Joseph had already passed away at this point in time. He never saw the end result. His life's name and his goals never materialized. I mean, think about that. From Joseph's perspective, he's a righteous person. He has great plans for his life. He has dedicated himself to serving the Lord. He's, I'm sure, anticipating a place at the city gate. He's anticipating being a leader. He set aside his life to serve God. And what does his community think? You know what? They don't even remember his name. Isn't this the carpenter's son? What was that guy's name? Joseph never became what Joseph would have had in mind for his plans because he obeyed. Goes on and lists his mother because these people were still alive. Isn't his mother's name Mary? Aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? We know all about this family. And what's the undercurrent in these verses is we know all about this family, and they're not impressive. You can't really, we've heard the stories. Everyone in the city could say, you know what? We know how to add. And they say that everything's okay and they're righteous, but we know that Jesus was born, and it wasn't even 9 months afterwards. Joseph, at this point, is hearing God say, don't be afraid. Go ahead and do it. And Joseph, in one moment, needs to make a decision whether he's going to accept his plan and stick to it. I'm a righteous person. I won't offend her. I won't expose her to public disgrace. I'm going to stand my ground, and everyone is going to still respect me. Or do I subject myself to all kinds of ridicule, but obey God? And I proposed at the very beginning when I shared the title of this, I said, God's plans are perfect. In the middle of the problems, in the middle of the moments, we need to know that He is the one with the perfect plans. The decision did not change some of the things. I said the decision to follow God changed everything, but there were some things that it didn't change. The community thought that Joseph wasn't a righteous person, but you know what? It really didn't change. Matter of fact, we can say Joseph was a righteous person. And why do we say that? Because he was obedient. These were the things that didn't change. His name may have been dragged through the mud, and in his generation, he was only known as the carpenter, and his children, the carpenter's sons. But you know what? Time always proves out that God's plans are perfect. Because here we are, 2,000 years later, that community couldn't remember the name of the carpenter. But you know what? Today, we remember his name. Today, none of us can remember the names of the leaders of that city who were saying, this guy can't be anybody important. Those people who thought they were very important, had created their own life plan, had lived up to it, had everything that they wanted. You know what? We don't even know their names. They're nobodies. They had their great plan, and they followed their great plan. And you know what? We don't remember them. But the one who had a good plan for his life and lost the good plan because he determined to obey God. He determined that he was going to give up his good plan, maybe even his great plan, for the perfect plan of God. We are still talking about him today. Because we can be those same people who obey God. He followed God's plan instead of his own, and we're still talking about him to this day. And you know what? God always has plans. It wasn't just for Joseph. It wasn't just for Mary. God wants to intervene in our lives, and he wants our plans to be substituted for his perfect plan. And you know what we know about the plans of God? Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." And if we were to tell this to Joseph when he was dying, and everyone just said, he's the carpenter, he's nobody important. You know, there's times in our lives we may feel like it didn't work out. It's not right. But I have some good news for you. The end of the story has yet to be written if we follow God's plan. You will never end up in that bad spot. As the psalmist says, "I was young and I'm old now, and I've never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread." There's a point when we can trust God above all of the circumstances, all of the things that we planned out for ourselves. And instead of getting frustrated that our plans are not working, we should get glad. We should be happy. We should have joy because we know that God is intervening and his plans are perfect. I'll tell you that when we came to Mexico and we were only going to be here for a few short months, you know what? If I had obeyed my plan, I'd be miserable. But I'm here today because God's plan was accepted. And I'll tell you, I wasn't like Joseph. I kicked and screamed. I threatened God many times. I know that you find that appalling and you would never do that. But I'll tell you, I look at my life today and I say, wow, how you have blessed by simply being willing to sacrifice my life plan that I had. I created a life plan when I was just 9 years of age. And I sacrificed that life plan. Kicking and screaming, but I sacrificed it. And I say, I couldn't imagine being more fulfilled and more complete because God's plans are always plans to prosper us and not to harm us. We may not be able to see it in the moment. When Joseph hears the angel say, "Take Mary as your wife," what was going through his mind? Explain that one to me. And you know what? God doesn't. We don't have all of a sudden this revelation. If God would have explained it, it would have been even worse. Yeah, Joseph, I have great plans for you. Oh, well, what are my plans? Well, you know, I know that you don't speak Arabic, but you're going to be spending several years in Egypt. And when you come back, everyone's going to laugh at you and mock you. You're going to end up living in an area where they say nothing good comes out of it. How's that for a good plan? You like it now? Now that you have all the details? You ever wonder why God doesn't give us the details? Because we would probably run kicking and screaming if we knew all the details. But after we've walked through it, we say, that's exactly what God needed. God has all of these things in control, and he has good plans. He has not just good plans, he has perfect plans for us. And we can sacrifice our good plans, our little plans, our big plans. Doesn't matter what level they are. If they're the plans for simply tomorrow, or the plans for all week next week, or next month, or all year, or our lifelong goal is there. We can sacrifice them all just simply knowing that God has great plans for us. You know, we may find ourselves in a place where we never expected. But yet, God is the one leading, if we accept him. Now, God could have done what God needed to do without Joseph. Joseph could have said, no, I have these good plans, and I'm going to stick to my plans. You know what? If that had been the case, Jesus would have still been born. If that had been the case, Jesus would have still saved us, ransomed us, changed our lives. But you know what? Nobody would know the name of Joseph. And he wouldn't be a part of the story. He wouldn't have had the opportunity to have interaction and teach these little hands of this little boy named Jesus growing up how to work and learn a craft and a trade. He would never have had these moments. But he subjected his plans to the approval of God. And God said, no, I have a plan that's even better. And I want to propose to you, the best thing that you could do in your life and for your plans is to simply obey God. Obeying God is always the right decision. If you have to throw out your plans, if it doesn't seem like things are working out, if you feel like your life is like that of Job, it says, my days have ended, my plans are shattered, and so are the desires of my heart. You know what? At the moment when your plans are shattered, that's probably the greatest time when God could come along and say, I'm glad your plans are all destroyed now. Are you ready to accept mine? And it's not an enjoyable process, I'll tell you. Crying and weeping and frustrated and depressed moments. Oh, it's terrible. But when we simply subject ourselves. And I got to tell you that I'm sure that Joseph, in his life, while he was living in Egypt, while he was in Nazareth, all of the places where he never wanted to be, I'm sure Joseph said the same thing that I said just a few moments ago. Never expected to be here. But wow, isn't it great serving God? I feel so fulfilled because the plans of God are perfect. Bow your heads with me, if you will.